All right, our next image that we're going to discuss is here on the left-hand side. This is by an artist named Bonaventura Berlinghieri, and it's called the St. Francis altarpiece. We're going to look for a few things here. One is to talk about what an altarpiece is, and we also want to talk about this particular Byzantine style. So we're going to complete our list of these Byzantine traits of the Middle Ages, and then we also want to talk about St. Francis and how he is very um, crucial to this new Renaissance style that we are going to be ushering in, not for about another 100 years at least, but it's coming. So we're going to talk about St. Francis and his role in Renaissance art. All right, first things first, this is what's called an altarpiece. An altarpiece is the backdrop for the Mass. During the Catholic Mass, on the altar, the back of the altar, during this time, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, would contain this huge altarpiece. You can usually tell an altarpiece because of the shape at the top. It's usually not just a squared off top. Usually this triangular top is usually a telltale sign. The St. Francis altarpiece, like many altarpieces, has been dismantled. So usually it would have hinges here on the side, and then it would have doors, and the doors would remain closed. So they would fold in here and remain closed during the week, and then they would open up, and they would have more stories on the sides. And they'd be opened up on Sundays or on the feast days of the saints. Usually the days that that saint had died, they'd be opened up as well. So this is an altarpiece, sort of different from the way you would experience the Mass today. Today the priest stands behind the altar and looks out at the congregation, but that's a relatively recent happening. Back at this time, the priest would stand with his back to the congregation, and this would be the backdrop for the Mass right there on the back of the altar. All right, so we know that this is used as an altarpiece. Let's talk next about this particular style that we see here before we talk about our St. Francis. What I want you to see is what are these Byzantine traits of the Middle Ages. Let's start sort of listing those. Number one, a good Byzantine work from the Middle Ages is covered in gold. You can see that around the outsides. The next thing to know is that they're usually flat. There's not a lot of modeling. So see how it looks pretty straight across. You really can't see the body underneath the robe. So that's one thing to note. Another thing is a floating quality. Remember, this is no longer this humanistic worldview that we had during Greco-Roman antiquity, but rather one that is purely religious. And we want these figures to look very different from the rest of us, from the melee of society. And so they tend to have this sort of floating effect. So you can see the fronts of his feet here. You don't really sense it. He has a sense of heaviness, of that sort of gravity working on his body. Let's go back to this idea of being flat. We see that his body is flat, but also the background is flat. Good Byzantine work doesn't usually give you a ton of information in the back. You don't see rolling hills. You don't see this perspective deep into the background. All of this works to make sure, again, that there is an otherworldliness about this particular figure and that he is separate from the rest of us. So it's important to see that this doesn't necessarily show an inability, but rather it is a purposeful aesthetic choice that we see here during the Middle Ages. A lot of these Byzantine traits I sort of encourage you to test out and see what you can find in this altarpiece. I chose this altarpiece as a companion work because it shows you what an intact altarpiece looks like, where St. Francis doors have been sort of, lobbed off and sent to different museums. This is one that is purely intact, and so they take different forms, and this would be, again, placed on the back of the altar. When we look here on the left-hand side with St. Francis, I'm going to give you another term, and that is Maniera Greca. That's on your term sheet. We also call this the Italo-Byzantine style. Italo-Byzantine is a little bit easier to remember because you can see all those Byzantine traits we just listed off. We are still in a Byzantine world of the Middle Ages, as our year is 1200. And Italo means Italy. And so it shows us how those Byzantine traits are translated by Italian artists. And so that's the style here that we see. Let's talk next about St. Francis himself and why he is a particularly important figure during this time. You may have seen St. Francis before. He's known for preaching to the birds. You can see the little story here. So oftentimes you see him in garden art. You can tell by the robe and the hairdo, which is a side note. It's called a tonsure, shaggy down here and bald here on the top. Saint Francis was a traveling preacher. He was not born poor, but he chose to lead a life of poverty, of humility, and he wanted to emulate Christ. He so passionately identified with Christ, Christ's earthly life, and Christ's suffering, that he received the stigmata. The stigmata are the wounds of Christ. And so you can see he miraculously received these. You can see him on the hands where Christ was nailed to the cross, and then on his feet. Good thing he's Byzantine. He's nicely floating, so you can certainly see those nail holes here. So he received these miraculously. He so passionately identified with Christ also that he believed that in art we should show the real existence of Christ, Christ's real earthly existence. So scenes from his birth, which we would call a nativity, scenes from his death, which we call the Passion of Christ. So he wanted to see stories not of Christ dwelling in a heavenly realm, things like Pentecost or hell or the harrowing of hell. Didn't want to see any of that. He wanted to see scenes from Christ's life on earth. Here's the next thing to know about St. Francis, is that he has a revelation in front of a painting, and he recognizes the power of art to bring one closer to God. So if you put it all together, we have a man who is emulating Christ, who wants to see real stories of Christ, and he knows that art can be very powerful to really sort of bring a person closer to God. So here's what he decides about art. He decides that we should show real stories of Christ in a way that shows the humanity of Christ at the same time, and that naturalism is imperative, because if you want to be psychologically sort of penetrating, if you want somebody to really understand the sacrifice of Christ, you can't have Christ gold-clad, resplendent, and floating in a heavenly realm. We have to be able to really identify with his sacrifice, and he has to look like a real human. Otherwise, we don't really recognize the sort of significance of Christ's life and how he died on the cross, because he doesn't look like one of us. So St. Francis said that this is a problem and that Christ needs to look like one of us in art. And so he influences late medieval culture. And a lot of Western art's intense interest in the real body, the real life, and the real humanity of Christ can be traced to St. Francis and his interest in these aspects. It's sort of difficult if you're looking at the year of 1200 and say, well, how can one man in 1200 before the days of technology and the internet be that influential? But it's something else to note that St. Francis starts the Franciscan order of monks, and the Franciscan order is spread far and wide throughout Europe. And so all of them had these same ideas of St. Francis about showing us the real body of Christ in a real humanistic way. And as we know, with the Renaissance's rebirth of Greco-Roman antiquity, that's what we're moving toward. Religious figures still, but with a real sort of human aspect. The next sort of seed that I want to plant when looking here at St. Francis is how you see all of these stories around the outside of St. Francis. These all tell us about his life, this sort of spontaneous healing, all these ways that he identified with Christ and was similar to Christ. But what's important to note is that oftentimes, and then we see over here on our other image from the 16th century, our other altarpiece, is that oftentimes in religious works, especially in the Middle Ages, you get a lot of information crammed into the scene. And that's because of the high rate of illiteracy. You had to be able to tell people about these figures because they couldn't read about these figures. Most 99% of women and 90% of men during the Middle Ages were illiterate. And so the way they understood their religion and their faith was through stories. And this is also before the printing press. And so it's not as though books were a dime a dozen. They would have to be handmade. And so most people were illiterate. They had no access to books. And so, sometimes more is less, but that's not that's not really the truth. When it comes to medieval arts, more is more is better, because you need to tell people about their faith.